these graphs in chapter 13.1 of GDP, they're for England. So how can we get graphs like this for the United States? Let's take a quick look here. If we go to Fred at, let's just search the St. Louis Federal Reserve. Um, so I'm just going to search for those terms, Fred, St. Louis Federal Reserve. And this is a service that the St. Louis Federal Reserve provides for economic data. So we have a search engine for economic data. We could just search for GDP to get the United States GDP. It looks like I misspelled it as GAP. Let's try that again. GDP, real gross domestic product. And here we have the chart for the US gross domestic product. If you wanted to create the log graph, you could hit the edit button over there and go down to units and pick natural log. And now we have our natural log graph here. So let me go back to the, not the log, but the normal units here. Okay, so taking a look, let's look at the more recent, notice the gray shading here. There's these vertical bars are the gray shadings. Those gray shadings show you the periods that are declared to be a recession. The periods are declared by the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER. When do they say that they're a recession? So you'll notice that wherever these gray bars are, that the GDP is going down at those points. So let me get rid of it, right? So here is the 2008 financial crisis, and you can see that substantially goes down, and that was a period of recession at that time. Let's look at the more just past 20 years here. 2020, 20, or 2000-1-1. And no, here we go. Okay, 2000, January. Okay, so this gives us the past 20 years. Notice this as it was climbing, it had that brief recession in 2001, but then was climbing back on a normal path. Notice that after the 2008 recession, we go down here and we resume growing at the previous rate, but we never get back up to. If you can imagine extending this line forward, you can imagine that there was this potential for the economy to grow that much. And we often estimate potential GDP. What's the most amount of GDP that we can create, right? During the recession, we don't create as much as our potential. And what happened after the 2008-2009 recession is that for the decade after, we never got back to what you would think the potential would have been prior to the recession. There's two things happening there, right? From that recession in 2008 and 2009, we've got a lot of people that became unemployed for 6 months, a year, 2 years. And as they got employed for so long, they lost their skills. They became unemployable in their old jobs, right? Anybody that was looking at it, they might have had a $70,000 a year job prior to the recession. Then you're unemployed for a year and a half, 2 years, right? People in the HR departments looking at the resume, seeing that they're unemployed for so long, they begin to get afraid that there's something wrong with them, right? And they're not going to hire them for that same $70,000 a year job. And so a lot of those people eventually went back to jobs that paid a lot less, which wasn't using their skills as productively. And they might have just forgotten a lot of the skills, right? So we have this decay in people's skills. We also have that during this period, there's not as much investment happening, right? And so that lack of investment means that in future years, our potential GDP is not as high as it used to be. So what happened there, right? If you consider if we had continued on our path that we were before, there's no reason we couldn't have done that, right? Compared to the actual path that we took. That is something of about, at the start of after the recession, about $1.5 trillion a year, closing down to a little less than $1 trillion a year. That is just incredible cost that over that decade, we lost something like 15 or 20 trillion dollars worth of production that people could have made because we weren't able to live up to their full GDP. And so looking here now recently, we see this giant drop off in GDP from COVID, and it bounced back a lot of the way, but not all the way so far, right? And so a lot of the fear is that with this COVID that we might have another situation like we had in 2008 and 2010, where we don't just lose production, don't just lose period for this short period, but if it maintains it for a long time that we're not producing as much, that's going to destroy our ability to keep our potential GDP in the future as high as it would be, right? And so this is one of the reasons that right now a lot of economists are calling for, we need a strong fiscal stimulus right now so that we don't have that same problem that we had after 2008 and 2009. Okay, so you can make graphs like this from the Federal Reserve, the FRED data set at the Federal Reserve. Just want to see how you could create those used for the United States data.